My sermon this morning is a continuation of the series on the book of 1 Timothy, Paul's first letter to the young pastor named Timothy. This is part 5 in the series, and it's called Characteristics of a Christian Leader, and it's from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. Grace be unto you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, you know, more than 30 years ago, when I was starting out in the ministry, some young guys from our church asked me if I might be interested in playing on their basketball team that was in the local men's rec league. And I said, sure, I love playing I played basketball in high school and in all college intramural basketball leagues. But when I went to the first game, I found out this was a whole nother kind of ball game, these rec league games. This was the men's A league, and it was very competitive, and it was very rough, and you could get smacked pretty hard. You had to get really clobbered to get a whistle from the referee. And I remembered about the second or third game of the season, we were in a close game late in the second half, and I had the ball on the wing, and I decided to drive baseline. I beat my guy baseline, got around him, driving baseline, and that guy who was guarding me just shoved me. He just shoved me. I went flying into the wall underneath the basket. He shoved me so hard. And I fell to the ground, lost the ball, and the whistle blew, and the referee just pointed the ball to the other team, you know. And I looked at him, and I'm sitting on the floor, and I just go, oh, man. And suddenly the ref started laughing out loud, and I said, what are you laughing about? And he said, I knew you were the new Lutheran pastor in town. I was just waiting to see if you were going to swear at me. Well, I learned that night that when you're in a position of leadership, especially in a church, the world is always watching. And that's what Paul is talking about in our text for today from the 3rd chapter of 1 Timothy. The title of this message, as I said, is Characteristics of a Christian Leader. Paul is instructing Timothy on the qualities that he should be looking for in the lives of those who are going to be leaders in the Ephesian church. Beginning with the pastors and including everyone who serves in the church in a public way. Now, Paul knows that it is not only the church members who are going to be watching those leaders, but the world will also be watching them. And he wants those leaders to live lives of high moral character, so that unbelievers do not have an opportunity to attack the integrity of the church. But even though these instructions are aimed at the leaders, they are also very good guidelines for all Christians, as we all represent Christ to the people in the outside of the church. We may not all be called to be leaders in the church, but we are all called to be leaders in the culture. We are called, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:20, to be ambassadors for Christ. So with that as our goal, I want to take a look at the instructions that Paul gives to Timothy for the conduct and integrity of leaders and see what those words have to say for all of us as we seek to influence our culture. Now I'm going to break the text down into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about 7 positive character traits that Paul says leaders should have. Second, I'm going to talk about 4 negative traits that Paul says leaders should not have. And then third, I'm going to talk about one more general trait that Paul mentions that is good for all of us to remember. All of us should be thinking about it as we walk the Christian walk in this world. So let's begin with those 7 positive character traits. Now remember, Paul is going to be talking about these traits as he discusses the leaders in the Ephesian church. But I'm going to apply these principles to all of us. I think all of these are real good reminders to us Christians, all of us, about what it means to represent Jesus in the community. And I'm going to move very quickly through these character traits. If I spent too much time on them, we'd be here all day. So a lot of these are just going to get very brief mention as I move through, and I'll pick out a few of them to expand on a little bit more. So let's begin. Number 1, Paul says, we must be above reproach. We must be above reproach. Now, Paul begins this section in chapter 3, verse 1, with these words. He says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Paul says it is a true calling to be a spiritual leader. And with that calling comes some expectations. He says in verse 2, therefore, an overseer must be above reproach. To be above reproach is kind of a summary of all of these things that he's going to talk about. To be above reproach is never to say anything or do anything or be in any place that might bring dishonor on your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ or on his church. So if you're about to make a Facebook comment and you think to yourself, I wonder if someone might misunderstand this and be offended by it, don't make the comment. If you're at a place and you think to yourself, if someone saw me here, I wonder if they might get the wrong impression of me, then probably you shouldn't be at that place. You know, we might have a constitutional right to say what we want to say and do what we want to do, but we also have a calling by God to represent Christ in the best way possible. So Paul begins this whole discussion by saying we must be above reproach. And then the second thing he says is we must be faithful in our relationships. We must be faithful in our relationships. Paul says an overseer must be the husband of one wife. Now, Paul is not talking about divorce and remarriage here. He's not saying if you've been divorced and you remarry, it's your second wife, you can't be a leader. That's not what he's saying. What he's talking about here is that a Christian leader who is married, or really any Christian who is married, should be a faithful, loving spouse to that person that they're married to. Now, Ephesus was a wealthy, cosmopolitan Greco-Roman city. And there were all kinds of different relationship configurations going on in that culture in that day. In fact, it was common for both men and women, especially men and women of the upper classes, to have a marriage for social reasons or political reasons, and then to have several sexual relationships on the side, usually with lower class people, often with household servants. And Paul is saying here that Christians, especially the leaders of the church, must be chaste if they are unmarried and faithful to their spouses when they are married, as an example to the surrounding community. Nothing can damage the reputation of a church more than when a person who claims to be a Christian has an affair or commits some kind of sexual sin. And the negative effect is magnified if that person is a pastor or another leader. In fact, just this past week in Columbus, Ohio, police arrested 110 men in a sting operation for attempting to solicit relationships with underage girls. And the subheading of the article, here was the main heading, and then the subheading of the article said, among those arrested were a doctor and a church leader. When I read that article, I read into it to see who the church leader was. It was a former youth pastor of a large church. And he got singled out. Of all those 110 men, he got singled out to be in the headline. Because the world is watching what church people do. They are watching to see if we practice what we preach. So we must be faithful in our relationships. Third, Paul says, we must be sober-minded. We must be sober-minded. The Greek word here is sometimes translated as temperate. It carries the connotation of doing all things in moderation. It's a concept that Paul mentions in several of his letters, do all things in moderation. There are many things in this world that people do to excess. But we who are Christians, especially Christian leaders, are called by God to use, but not abuse, the gifts of his creation. We are to control our natural appetites. And that leads very naturally into the next point, which is that we must be self-controlled. That's point number 4. We must be self-controlled. In order to be temperate, a person must have some control over their thoughts and their actions. You know, when I was thinking about this trait the other day, I happen to remember a football play from a Bears game a few years back. The Bears and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were in overtime, and the Bears had just made an important defensive stop. I had a vague memory of it, and so I went back and looked it up. It was 2008, I believe, is when the game happened. But as one of the Bears, or one of the Tampa Bay offensive linemen was getting up from the ground during overtime, he gave a Bears defensive back, a guy named Charles Tillman, Peanut Tillman, gave him a little bump. He was just kind of baiting him. And what happened was that Tillman could not control his temper. And he took a swing at the guy, and he got a personal foul, a 15-yard penalty, and that penalty cost the Bears the game, and they missed the playoffs that year by 1 game. So that penalty cost a game that cost them the playoffs. You know, when we lose our control of our emotions in life, it can cause a lot more damage than a lost football game. An angry outburst at the wrong time can destroy a relationship. It can do damage to a family. It can do damage to a church. And that's why Paul says, as Christians, we must be self-controlled. And then when we have control of our emotions, it's more likely that we can accomplish the fifth thing that Paul mentions. He says we must be respectable. To be respectable is to act in ways that people admire, in ways that they respect. If you are an honest person, if you are a reliable person, if you are a person that people can count on to keep your word, to follow through on your commitments, you will slowly gain the respect of the people. And when you gain the respect of people, then the next thing on Paul's list is critical. He says that now you have people who respect you, who admire you, and he says then we must be hospitable. To be hospitable is to be someone who is kind and generous, someone who is approachable, someone who wants to help you if they can. You know, I was at a pastor's conference once, and one of the speakers said, one of the things that we pastors need to learn is how to say no. Now, I raised my hand. I want to make a comment. There was a small gathering. About 40 pastors or so were there. And I raised my hand and said, you know, I need to say something about that. I said, I realize what you're trying to say, that we don't want to take on so much that we get burned out. There's a real problem with pastor burnout sometimes. I said, but I think that there are a lot more churches out there that are dying because too many pastors, too many church leaders don't say yes enough. We need to get better at saying yes to people's needs and yes to people's concerns and yes to people's ideas. We need to be better at making people feel welcomed and listened to and cared about. That's what Paul means when he says we must be hospitable. And then the seventh positive thing that Paul talks about is we must be able to teach. Now, I recognize that not everyone in the church is called to be a preacher or teacher in a formal setting. There was a survey done a few years ago, in fact, that asked people to rank their greatest fears, and the result of that survey was that the number one fear of most people was public speaking. Death was number 2. So most people would rather die than have to speak in front of a bunch of people. Well, in 3 of his letters, Paul describes biblical preaching and teaching as spiritual gifts. Not everyone is gifted in that way. Your pastors should be gifted in that way, or if they're not, they probably shouldn't be pastors because it's an essential part of what we do. But we can all be teachers of the faith in some way. There are ways that we can all do that. I thank God for our Sunday school teachers. I thank God for our Bible study leaders. Beyond that, I believe that we all have roles to be teachers of the faith in our own homes. You know, no one needs a theological education to teach the basics of the Christian faith to children or to grandchildren. All you need is a children's Bible and a heart that loves Jesus. You know, my mom is a wonderful Christian woman, but she is one of those women who would rather die than speak publicly. And yet she is the person who taught me the faith. She is the one who taught me by reading to me, the Bible to me. She is the one who taught me by praying with me. She is the one who taught me by singing hymns around the house, those hymns that are still stuck in my head 50 years later. She is the one who taught me the faith simply by living out her faith. So she was teaching. So we're not all called to be pastors. We're not all called to be Bible teachers, but in our own way and with our own gifts, we must be able to teach. So those are the 7 positive character traits that Paul wants church leaders to have, but really they are traits that every Christian can and should have and try to exhibit in their own life. Now I want to turn to the 4 negative traits, character traits that Paul talks about, 4 negative character traits. These are the ones Paul says the leaders of the church should avoid. And what's good for the leaders is good for all of us. The first thing that Paul says here is that we must not be drunkards. Now, Paul is not saying that a Christian should never drink alcohol. Now, there are some Christians who choose not to drink at all, and that's okay. They see how alcohol has often been abused in our culture, and some people just choose to stay away from it completely, and that's fine. That's a personal decision that some Christians make, and it's a good thing for them. But the biblical principle is that we don't have to not drink. It's to be temperate. It's to do all things in moderation. And that includes the use of alcohol. Paul lived in a day when alcohol was abused in his culture as well. It was Greco-Roman world wine was Wine drinking was a huge thing. It was a huge problem for a lot of people, maybe even more than it is today. But Paul did not command Timothy not to drink. In fact, later in the book in chapter 5, when we get there, Paul is going to suggest that Timothy have a little wine, because apparently he was having some stomach problems. I think sounds from the context, they were stress related. And I don't know if the wine would help him with that, but that's what Paul tells him. Try having a little wine at night. But the principle that Paul is setting down here is that Christians should not be going out and getting drunk, is what he's saying. A little bit of alcohol in a social setting or to relax in the evening, there's nothing wrong with that. One of my favorite things to do on a Sunday evening is have a little bit of red wine. Helps me relax at the end of a long week. But Paul says, for the sake of our witness in the world, and so that we are always in control of our words and actions, do not drink to excess. And if you're a person who has a problem with alcohol and you can't stop at a drink or two, it would be better not to drink at all. We must not be drunkards. Then the second negative thing Paul says is we must not be violent, but gentle. We must not be violent, but gentle. I hope that this negative trait is obvious. There are times when Christians might have to do something aggressive to protect human life, but those times will be rare. Christians are not called to be brawlers. We are called to be peacemakers. We are called to be gentle spirits in a very angry and violent and divisive world. And I'm telling you, this country needs Christians to act like Christians right now. We have Christians on both sides of the political spectrum, and we need to show the world how the two sides can get along, even if we have profound political differences. And I'm not saying here that Christians should be weak. We need to be strong in our beliefs about what is important, but it should be a strength that comes with restraint. The world does not seem to know how to do this anymore, how to be strong but use restraint in the way we deal with other people. And we need to teach them. We need to lead on this. We must not be violent but gentle. A third negative thing Paul talks about is related to this. He says, we must not be quarrelsome. We must not be quarrelsome. Not only should we not be acting with violence, but we should not be arguing with people. I love a good discussion as much as anyone. But over the years, I've learned that as a Christian, if I see that a discussion is getting heated, I should be the one to bring it down. I should be the one to de-escalate the situation. I've had to learn the hard way sometimes on Facebook. I get in the middle of some of these discussions, and they get hot pretty quickly. Facebook and Twitter and other kinds of social media are terrible places to have discussions about hot-button topics. No matter how reasonable you think you are being, someone will misinterpret what you said and will get really angry. And I remember once I made what I thought was a pretty benign comment on someone's Facebook post about a controversial issue, and I got a blistering response from one of my former youth group kids from my first church. So I don't do that anymore. I don't want to lose a relationship with someone or turn someone off to Jesus Christ because of some stupid political argument that doesn't make a lick of difference in the bigger picture. The bigger picture is what God is calling us to do in this world. So as Christians, we must not be quarrelsome. And then Paul says a fourth negative trait is that as Christians, we must not be lovers of money. Paul is going to talk about this in greater detail in chapter 6. Chapter 6 is where we have the famous verse, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. That's 1 Timothy 6:10. I don't think that I have to say a lot about this right here. We all know what it means to use money to provide for ourselves and our families. And we know that God has blessed us in this nation with more than most of the world has for our life necessities. And so we actually have some excess that we can use to enjoy our time on this earth. And I encourage you to use what God has blessed you with to enjoy life in this world. But we should never get to the point in life where we just love the money itself, that we just love the stuff it can buy. We should never let money become that false god in our lives. John D. Rockefeller was once asked, how much money is enough money? And he responded by saying, just a little bit more. That, my friends, is a love of money. But God has devised this great way for us to prevent money from becoming our idol. It's called giving. That includes giving to the church. It also includes giving to worthy causes outside of the church. It includes helping out people in need that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. If you do that, money will not become a false god for you. If you have a generous spirit, money will not become a false god. We must not be lovers of money. So those are the main things Paul has to say about the character traits that Timothy should be looking for in the leaders that he will choose for the Ephesian church. And I've tried to make the case that these are all good character traits for all of us as Christians, whether we are in leadership positions in the church or whether we are faithful members and volunteers. And I want to wrap this up by talking about one more character trait. In the first half of our text for today, Paul has been talking about the character traits of what he calls the overseers. Overseers is an English translation of the Greek word episkopos. It was a term that in later centuries of the church would come to refer to the bishops who were overseers of large areas. But in the first century, when this letter was written, it really just referred to the pastors of the local church, the spiritual leaders of the local church. So Paul is talking about the character of those pastors and leaders. The second half of the text, Paul lays out what he believes should be the character traits of lay leaders in the church. The Greek word for these lay leaders is diakonos. It's where we get our English word deacons. And it should not surprise you that most of the character traits that Paul lays out for the deacons are the same character traits that he lays out for the overseers. So I'm not going to walk through all of those verses on the deacons because much of what I would say about them are things I've already said. But there is one more trait I want to talk about that is mentioned in both sections for overseers and for deacons, and it's something that I think we should apply to our own lives as well. It's the statement that Paul makes to both that says we must manage our households well. Now, obviously, it's a very broad topic. I could do a whole sermon series on the Christian family and relationships. So I'm not going to try to say everything here in just a couple of minutes, but there's one main thing I want to say. One of the things I really love about the Apostle Paul is that he has this incredibly high regard for marriage and family. It's also one of the things I love about Martin Luther. Of course, Luther loved the writings of Paul, so I'm sure that he got a lot of his love about family from Paul and by studying the letters of Paul. And Luther talks a lot about the importance of the Christian home. You know, Paul wasn't even married himself. Paul never had any children. He knew that God had called him to travel the world. He knew that God had called him to be the missionary to the Gentiles. And he knew that that all that travel would never be compatible with having a wife and children. So Paul chose not to marry. But Paul believed that the Christian family was critical to the strength of the Christian church. And so in this letter, he urges Timothy, he urges the other leaders, make sure that as you are doing your work in the church, that you are also faithfully leading and caring for your families at home. You know, Billy Graham was once asked if he had any regrets about his life in ministry, and without missing a beat, he said that his greatest regret was that he allowed his work and his travel to take him away from his family so often. His wife Ruth and his children, they always knew that he loved them, but they also were hurt by the fact that he wasn't around for many of the significant events in their lives, and that's the one regret. He said, if I could go back and do it all over again, I would change that. And I've tried to learn from that mistake. Billy Graham, when I was in college, he visited our college a few times because he was a graduate of the same college I went to, Wheaton College. And he came once and spoke to our Student Pastoral Society, which was when I was a senior, it was a group of people who were considering going into the ministry, and we would meet once a month and have speakers. And when he was on campus once, he came and spoke to us, and he talked about this. Don't neglect your families. And I've tried to learn from that, tried to make family a priority in my life. I know I failed to do that sometimes. Sometimes I let ministry get, just so involved in ministry in my life that I miss something with the family. But in the overall picture, I think Lisa and I have struck a pretty good balance. It's not easy to be a Christian family these days. But it's so important, if we are going to make a positive impact for Jesus Christ in our culture, that we must manage our households well. And so may God bless you as you seek to be a man or woman of God, the one that you are called to be. God bless you as you strive to live out these characteristics of a Christian leader, which are really characteristics for all of us. And you're going to fail at some of these from time to time. We are all sinners. We all fail. That's why Jesus died on the cross for you. That's why he gave his life for you. And now we give our lives back to him. And may our church and may the families in our church be a powerful witness for Jesus Christ in the world, and especially right here in Princeton, Illinois, and in Franklin Grove too. Amen and amen.